I am going to discuss on the topic respiration in amphibians. Amphibians have the most complicated respiratory organs primarily because the amphibians includes all those animals which live partly in water and partly on the land. Their skin is usually soft, glandular, and moist, lacking in external scales. Hence, amphibia respire through skin, external gills, internal gills, lining of buccopharyngeal cavity, and the lung. So first one, gills. Amphibia respire through gills that is known as branchial respirations, and gills are two types, external gills and the internal gills. The external gills that project from the surface of the pharynx towards the water surface and rhythmically moved by the branchial muscles for ventilation. External gills persist throughout the life of neoteric salamanders, as per example Nycturus. Frog tadpole first develop external gills where they are replaced by internal gills later. Few urodels retain external gills as the respiratory organs in adults. In tadpole, before gill slits perforate, external gills develop as finger-like elevation on the outer surface of the visceral arches. Number 3 to 5. A rudimentary gill may develop on 6 arch. Now, internal gills. From hyoid arch, a fleshy operculum, that is the opercular chamber, that grows backward over the entire gill apparatus and encloses it in a opercular cavity. Internal gills serve throughout the moist tadpole stage. In larval urodels and Sicilians, a vestigial operculum makes an appearance, but it becomes only a small fold on hyoid arch. Gill lamellae are richly supplied with blood vessels in which blood flows in opposite direction to the water flow. Water is drawn into gills, then blood flowing in the capillaries of the gill lamellae absorb oxygen from the water and release carbon dioxide. Water containing carbon dioxide is thrown out from the gills, and the 80% maximum incoming water is absorbed in this process. Now, the skin. In many larvae and the adults, the skin is an important respiratory organ. The skin is thin and richly supplied with blood vessels, serve as a gas exchange organ whenever the animals are underwater or in extremely moist places. Tadpoles, salamander, larvae, and few types of adult salamanders breathe primarily through their gills. However, they can get rid of excess carbon dioxide through their skin. Where presence of an air bubble lung is maladaptive for locomotion, they have lost lungs, and the respiration is cutaneous respiration that exhibits a remarkable supplementary respiratory adaptation. For salamanders living in quiet water, the lungs have some respiratory function, but are more important as hydrostatic organ, similar to the swim bladder of teleost. There are vascular folds of epidermis into which blood capillaries are penetrated. Now come to buccopharyngeal lining. The buccopharyngeal membranes are vascular and serve as a respiratory surface in a wide variety of amphibians. In some species that remain submerged in water for long periods, gas exchange by buccopharyngeal lining play a significant role. Buccopharyngeal cavity provides a small percentage of gas exchange in some plethodontid salamanders that are lungless salamanders. And in frog, buccopharyngeal respiration occurs when the frog is not submerged in water. The lining of mouth is very moist and can be used to bring oxygen into the bloodstream by dissolving and diffusing into the blood capillaries. Now, lungs. Adult amphibians are lung breathers. As in all tetrapods, the amphibian lungs develop from the floor of the alimentary canal just behind the gill slit region. They are supplied with blood by derivatives of the arteries to the last gill arch and drained by the pulmonary vein, which go directly to the heart. The lungs lie within the pleuroperitoneal cavity and visceral peritoneum, except anteriorly, where they are attached to the anterior walls of the body cavity. The lumen of each lung is cutaneous, either directly or through very short bronchi, with the laryngeal chamber, a midline structure deep to the floor of the pharynx, lined with muscles and small cricoid and arytenoids, cartilages. The cartilages surround a slit-like opening into the pharynx called the glottis, which is controlled by the laryngeal muscles attached to the laryngeal cartilage. In most tetrapods, the glottis opens in the floor of the pharynx, just anterior to the opening of the esophagus. In amphibians, however, there is a deep concavity in the floor of the oropharynx that is particularly prominent in anurans, and the position of the glottis is shifted to a posterior vertical surface of the concavity just ventral to the esophagus. During respiration, sphincter muscles close to the esophagus, the internal complexity of the lungs and hence extent of its respiratory membrane vary according to the order. Septa support the vascularized respiratory membranes and divide the lung into intercommunicating air spaces that is known as infundibuli. If you see the section of the lung, that are the blood capillaries and that are the visceral peritoneum, and this is the alveoli, this is the lumen of the lung, and these are the connective tissue, and this is the inner epithelium. That are the section of lung that show the different composition. And there are also smooth muscles just deep to the vascularized layer. In frogs and toads, the septa are more complex than salamanders and caecilians. The septa divide the lung into more and smaller air spaces. That is known as the alveoli. You see here, that are the alveoli, giving a large total surface area for the respiratory membrane. Toads, whose keratinized skin permits little cutaneous respiration, have the most complex alveoli and the largest respiratory membrane. Now come to the ventilation. What is ventilation? Amphibians force air into their lung by a pumping action of the floor of the oral cavity in association with the action of valves that surround the external nares. Now the ventilation occurs by inhalation and exhalation. During inhalation, the external nares are opened and the floor of the oral cavity is depressed by contraction of mylohyoid and other muscles. Atmospheric pressure forces the air into the oral cavity. The nares are then closed by smooth muscle action and the floor of the mouth is now elevated. This action forces the air in the only one direction, through the glottis into the lung, through the glottis into the lung. In male anurans, opening the entrance to the vocal sacs would also force air to enter those chambers. During exhalation, the body wall muscles compress the content of the pleuroperitoneal cavity and thus force the air up into the oral cavity. Pterygoid muscles contract and raise the floor of the buccal cavity and pump air out. Sometimes the air may then be pumped back into the lungs again or released out through the open nostrils. Urodels gulps air as well as inhale via the external nares, but the floor of the mouth must still force the air into the lungs. In exhaling, some urodels, like siren, with open gill slits, eject the air forcefully through the slits. In tail frog living in the mountain stream of USA has reduced lung, which help the animal to live in the water. In perinebranchiate urodels, the lungs are simple saccular organs and perform hydrostatic function. In alpine salamander and Dusker salamander, the lungs are absent. In African frog, such as Astylosternus, the lungs are vestigials. In Sicilians, the tracheal lung may be present, but the left one is always rudimentary. In aquatic urodels, the lungs act secondarily as hydrostatic organ. And in all this above, the respiration is exclusively pharyngeal or cutaneous in nature. And frogs do not have the necessary chest, and stomach muscles cannot inhale and exhale as we do. Instead, they fill their mouth cavity with air, close their mouth, and force air back through an opening that is known as glottis into the lung. The glottis then closes to keep the air into the lung for a short time. Frogs can also direct some of the air they take into a pair of expandable vocal sacs near their mouth. Frogs croak by forcing air from these sacs over vocal cords in their throat by directing air back and forth through the throat between the vocal sacs and the lungs. Frog can even croak underwater. That is interesting. The production of the sound is a protective response for fear, and the males call the females during breeding season. The noise is produced by the vibration of the vocal cords in the laryngotracheal chamber. The vocal sacs in the males of some anneurons develop as the buccal outgrowths serve as resonator. Sound produced by female anneurons are of much less magnitude in comparison to the males. These are the reference books: Comparative Anatomy of the Vertebrates, Saxena and Saxena; Comparative Anatomy of the Vertebrates, Kent and Carr; Vertebrates, Comparative Anatomy, Functional Evolution, Cardang; and Elements of Chordate Anatomy, like maximum photographs in my lecture captured from Google image. Thank you, everybody.